The sun beat down on the dusty road, its rays shimmering off the endless expanse of red dirt that stretched out in every direction. There was no sign of life for miles, except for the occasional kangaroo that hopped across the road and disappeared into the bush. Sarah had been driving for hours, the monotonous landscape taking its toll on her. She had left behind the bustling city of Perth with its skyscrapers and crowded streets for the vast emptiness of the Outback. It was supposed to be a break from the stresses of urban life, a chance to reconnect with nature and find herself. But as she drove deeper into the Outback, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was heading into the unknown. The road was long and winding, and there were no signs to tell her where she was or how far she had to go. As the sun began to set, Sarah realized she needed to find a place to camp for the night. She pulled off the road and into a small clearing, surrounded by trees and scrub. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. She set up her tent and started a fire, grateful for the warmth and light. But as the darkness closed in around her, she began to feel uneasy. She had heard stories of the dangers of the Outback, of the deadly snakes and spiders that lurked in the shadows. She tried to push the thoughts from her mind and settled down in her tent for the night. But as she lay there, she heard strange noises coming from outside. It sounded like something was scratching at the tent, trying to get in. Sarah's heart raced as she fumbled for her flashlight. She shone it towards the entrance of the tent, but there was nothing there, just the endless darkness of the Outback. She tried to calm herself down, telling herself it was just her imagination, but the scratching continued, growing louder and more persistent. It sounded like something was trying to claw its way through the fabric of the tent. Sarah was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or call for help. She could feel her breathing quickening and her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she had to do something, but she couldn't bring herself to leave the safety of the tent. And then, suddenly, the scratching stopped. The silence was almost worse than the noise as Sarah waited for whatever was outside to make its move. She lay there, frozen with fear, for what felt like hours. But eventually, exhaustion overtook her, and she drifted off to sleep. When she woke up the next morning, the sun was shining and the birds were singing. She tried to convince herself it had all been a nightmare, but the claw marks on the outside of her tent told a different story. Sarah knew then that the Outback was not the peaceful retreat she had imagined. There was something out there, something lurking in the darkness, and she wasn't sure she was ready to face it. Sarah packed up her campsite and got back on the road, her mind still reeling from the unsettling encounter the night before. She drove for hours, the endless expanse of red dirt and scrub stretching out before her. As the day wore on, the heat became almost unbearable. Sarah could feel the sweat trickling down her back, and her mouth was dry and parched. She had finished all the water in her canteen, and there was no sign of civilization for miles. Just as she was starting to worry about dehydration, Sarah spotted a small gas station up ahead. It was a welcome sight, and she pulled in eagerly, hoping to buy some water and maybe even a snack. As she got out of her car and walked towards the gas station, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There were no cars parked outside, no signs of life except for a single flickering light in the window. Sarah approached cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. She pushed open the door and stepped inside. The gas station was deserted, the shelves bare, and the cash register empty. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator, stocked with nothing but expired drinks. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she realized she was completely alone. She was about to leave when she heard a rustling sound coming from the back of the store. "Hello," she called out tentatively. "Is anyone there?" There was no answer, but the rustling continued, growing louder and more urgent. Sarah's curiosity got the better of her, and she cautiously made her way towards the back of the store. As she turned the corner, she was met with a horrifying sight. A man was crouched in the corner, his face contorted in agony. He was covered in scratches and bites, and blood was oozing from his wounds. In his hand, he held a small revolver. Sarah froze, unsure of what to do. She had never seen anything like this before, and her mind was racing with questions. "Are you okay?" she asked. Taking a step forward, the man's head snapped up, his eyes wild with fear. "Stay back," he yelled, pointing the gun at her. "I've been bitten. You don't want to get too close." Sarah's heart raced as she realized the severity of the situation. The man was infected with something, and she didn't want to risk getting sick. She backed away slowly, her hands raised in surrender. "I won't hurt you," she said. "I just want to help." But the man was beyond reason. He kept the gun trained on her as she backed out of the store, his eyes burning with madness. As Sarah got back in her car and drove away, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just narrowly escaped a dangerous situation. There was something about the Outback that was unpredictable, and she knew she needed to be more cautious if she was going to survive. Sarah drove for hours, the memory of the infected man still fresh in her mind. She felt like she was in a different world, one where danger lurked around every corner. Just as the sun began to set, Sarah spotted something in the distance. It was an abandoned settlement, a cluster of buildings that looked like they had been untouched for years. Sarah's curiosity got the better of her, and she decided to explore. She pulled up to the main building, a weathered old hotel that looked like it had been built in the early 1900s. As she stepped out of her car, she felt a sense of unease. There was something about the settlement that felt wrong, like she was intruding on a place that had been left alone for a reason. But Sarah pushed her fears aside and began to explore. She walked through the abandoned hotel, her footsteps echoing through the empty halls. As she walked, she noticed something strange. All of the furniture and fixtures were still in place, like the hotel had been abandoned in a hurry. There were half-empty glasses on the bar, and clothes still hanging in the wardrobes. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that someone had left in a hurry, like they were running from something. As she continued to explore, she stumbled upon an old diary. It belonged to a woman who had lived in the settlement years ago, when it was still a thriving community. The woman wrote about strange occurrences in the Outback, things that couldn't be explained by natural causes. She wrote about strange creatures that roamed the desert at night, and how the settlers were never truly safe. As Sarah read the diary, she began to realize that there was more to the Outback than she had ever imagined. There was something ancient and powerful lurking beneath the surface, something that had been there for thousands of years. Suddenly, Sarah heard a noise coming from outside. It was a low growl, followed by a scratching sound. She cautiously made her way to the window and peered outside, her heart pounding in her chest. In the fading light, she could see the outline of a large creature, its fur matted and its eyes glowing in the darkness. Sarah realized too late that she had made a mistake. She was alone in the middle of the Outback, surrounded by creatures she couldn't begin to understand, and there was no one coming to help her. Sarah's heart raced as she watched the creature outside the window, It was massive, with razor-sharp claws and teeth that glinted in the moonlight. She knew she was in grave danger. The creature sniffed the air and let out another low growl. Sarah tried to back away, but her foot caught on a piece of debris, and she stumbled backward, crashing to the ground. The creature heard the nose and began to move towards the hotel, its eyes locked on Sarah. Sarah scrambled to her feet and tried to run, but the creature was too fast. It lunged forward, its jaws open wide, and Sarah knew that she was about to die. But at the last second, something else caught the creature's attention. It turned and sprinted off into the darkness, leaving Sarah gasping for air and shaking with fear. She realized that there were other creatures out there, and they were all hunting her. Sarah knew that she couldn't stay in the settlement any longer. She had to get out of the Outback, and fast. But she was miles from civilization, with no one to turn to. Desperate, she returned to her car and started the engine. She drove down the long, dusty road, her eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of danger. But it was too late. Sarah heard a thud from the back of the car and realized that one of the creatures had caught up to her. She glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the creature's eyes glowing in the darkness. She slammed her foot on the accelerator, but the creature held on, its claws scraping against the metal. Sarah knew that she had to do something, anything, to survive. She reached for the emergency kit in the glove compartment and pulled out a canister of pepper spray. With a shaky hand, she rolled down the window and aimed the pepper spray at the creature. She pressed down on the trigger, and a cloud of mist shot out, hitting the creature square in the face. The creature let out a blood-curdling scream and stumbled backward, giving Sarah just enough time to speed away. As she drove deeper into the Outback, Sarah realized that she was being hunted, and she didn't know if she would make it out alive. Sarah drove for hours, her mind racing with thoughts of the creatures that were chasing her. She was exhausted, but she knew that she couldn't stop, not until she was safe. As the sun began to rise, Sarah saw something in the distance. It was a massive crater, a gaping hole in the earth that seemed to go on forever. Something about the crater called to her, and she knew that she had to explore it. She parked her car and began to make her way down the steep slope. As she descended, she felt a sense of unease. The air was thick with a strange energy, like something was pulsing just beneath the surface. As Sarah reached the bottom of the crater, she saw something that made her blood run cold. It was a tunnel, a dark, foreboding hole that led deep into the earth. Sarah hesitated, unsure if she should continue, but something about the tunnel drew her in, like a moth to a flame. She stepped forward, and as she did, the air around her began to grow colder. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, and Sarah felt like she was descending into the abyss. Finally, she saw a light in the distance, a faint glow that beckoned her forward. She quickened her pace, her heart pounding in her chest. As she reached the end of the tunnel, she saw something that made her gasp in horror. It was a massive underground chamber filled with strange, otherworldly creatures. They were unlike anything she had ever seen before, with glowing eyes and twisted, alien features. They seemed to be worshipping something in the center of the chamber, a pulsing, glowing mass that seemed to radiate power and energy. Sarah realized too late that she had stumbled upon something ancient and powerful, something that had been hidden deep beneath the Outback for thousands of years. As she turned to run, she saw the creatures begin to move towards her, their eyes locked on her with a hunger that made her blood run cold. Sarah knew that she was in the fight of her life, and that if she didn't act fast, she would be consumed by the darkness that lurked beneath the earth. Sarah stumbled backward, her eyes locked on the creatures advancing towards her. She knew that she was in deep trouble and that there was no way she could fight them all off. But then something strange happened. The creatures suddenly stopped in their tracks, and a low rumbling sound filled the chamber. Sarah looked towards the center of the chamber and saw that the glowing mass was growing larger, its light intensifying with each passing second. Suddenly a figure stepped out of the shadows, a tall, cloaked figure with piercing eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. She knew that this figure was the key to her survival. The figure spoke, its voice echoing through the chamber. "You have stumbled upon something that you were not meant to see, but I have used for you." Sarah felt a mixture of fear and relief wash over her. She knew that she had no choice but to obey. The figure continued, "You will be our sacrifice, a gift to the darkness that lies beneath the earth, and in return, we will give you power beyond your wildest dreams." Sarah felt her blood run cold. She knew that this was her last chance to escape, but the creatures were closing in on her. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. Then, with a sudden burst of strength, she lunged forward, sprinting towards the tunnel that led back to the surface. The creatures were right behind her, their claws tearing at her clothes and skin. But Sarah was determined to make it out alive. As she burst into the sunlight, she felt a wave of relief wash over her. She collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that she had narrowly escaped with her life, but she also knew that the darkness beneath the Outback was still there, waiting for its next victim, and she knew that she could never let her guard down again. Sarah sat in her car, the events of the past few days playing over and over in her mind. She had narrowly escaped with her life, but she knew that she would never be the same again. The darkness that lurked beneath the Outback had left its mark on her, and she knew that she would carry that mark with her for the rest of her life. But despite everything, she felt a sense of triumph. She had faced her fears and come out alive, and that was something that she could be proud of. As she drove away from the crater, she knew that she was leaving behind something ancient and powerful, something that was best left buried beneath the earth. But she also knew that there would be others who would stumble upon the darkness that lurked beneath the Outback, and she knew that they would not all be as lucky as she had been. Sarah made a promise to herself that day, a promise to always be vigilant, to always be on guard against the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface. And as she drove into the horizon, she knew that she had faced the greatest challenge of her life, and that she had emerged victorious. 10 years had passed since Sarah's harrowing experience in the Outback. She had tried to put the memories behind her and move on with her life, but she knew that she could never forget what had happened. Over the years, she had become a well-respected scientist, focusing her research on the strange and mysterious forces that lurked beneath the Earth's surface. She had even been approached by a team of fellow scientists who were studying a strange phenomenon in the Outback. Sarah was hesitant to return to the place where she had almost lost her life, but her curiosity got the better of her. She agreed to join the team, knowing that it would be a difficult journey both physically and emotionally. As they arrived at the site, Sarah felt a sense of unease wash over her. The memories of what had happened there flooded back to her, and she knew that she had to stay focused on the task at hand. The team set up their equipment and began their research, but it wasn't long before they discovered that something was amiss. The same strange energy that Sarah had felt 10 years earlier was still present, and it seemed to be growing stronger. Sarah's heart sank as she realized what was happening. The darkness that she had faced all those years ago was still there, still waiting for its next victim. She tried to warn the team, to convince them to leave, but they were too engrossed in their research. They didn't believe her warnings, dismissing them as the ramblings of a traumatized survivor. It wasn't long before things took a turn for the worse. One by one, members of the team began to disappear, dragged into the darkness by the creatures that lurked beneath the earth. Sarah knew that she had to act fast. She gathered what equipment she could and made a break for it, determined to make it out alive. As she ran, she could hear the creatures closing in on her, their claws scraping against the rock, but she refused to give up. She had faced this darkness before, and she knew that she could do it again. She burst out of the cave, gasping for air, and collapsed on the ground. As she looked up at the sky, she knew that she had once again narrowly escaped with her life. But as she caught her breath, she knew that the darkness was still out there, waiting for its next victim, and she knew that she had a responsibility to warn others about the dangers that lurked beneath the earth's surface. Sarah made a vow to herself that day, a vow to use her knowledge and experience to help others avoid the same fate that had almost befallen her, and she knew that she would never stop fighting against the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface. As Sarah recovered from her ordeal, she couldn't help but wonder about the fate of the creatures that had attacked her and the team. She knew that they were dangerous and needed to be dealt with, but she also had a sense of empathy for them. They were ancient beings, after all, and had likely been living in the Outback long before humans had even set foot on the continent. Sarah spent months researching the creatures, trying to understand their biology and behavior. She soon discovered that they were unlike anything that had ever been documented before. They were not of this world, but had somehow made their home deep beneath the earth's surface. Despite her initial empathy for the creatures, Sarah knew that they could not be left to roam free. They were a danger to anyone who came across them, and it was only a matter of time before they attacked again. Sarah worked tirelessly to develop a plan to eradicate the creatures, but it was no easy task. They were strong and resilient, and their underground network was vast and complex. In the end, Sarah and a team of experts were able to develop a toxin that could be introduced into the underground network, effectively killing the creatures without causing harm to any other organisms in the area. It was a risky plan, but Sarah knew that it was the only way to ensure that the creatures would never harm anyone again. The team set to work injecting the toxin into the underground network over the course of several days. At first, it seemed like it had no effect, but eventually the creatures began to die off one by one. It was a gruesome sight, but Sarah knew that it was necessary. She watched as the creatures writhed and convulsed, their bodies slowly breaking down until there was nothing left. When it was all over, Sarah felt a sense of sadness. Despite their danger, the creatures had been a part of the Outback for centuries, and now they were gone forever. But she also felt a sense of relief. The danger that had lurked beneath the earth's surface was no more, and she knew that she had done her part to protect others from the same fate that had almost befallen her. 25 years passed, and Sarah had long since retired from her work as a biologist. She had settled down in a small town not far from the Outback and had started a family. Her life had been peaceful, and she had almost forgotten about the creatures that she had fought so hard to eliminate. But one day, reports started coming in from the Outback. People had gone missing, and strange noises had been heard in the night. Sarah's heart sank as she realized what was happening. The creatures had returned. At first, the government tried to keep the news under wraps, but it soon became clear that they could not contain the situation. The creatures were more aggressive than ever, and they were attacking anyone who entered their territory. Sarah knew that she had to act. She contacted the government and offered her expertise, and they were more than willing to accept her help. She gathered a team of experts, including some of the people who had helped her eliminate the creatures 25 years ago. The situation was dire. The creatures had grown in number and strength, and they were more organized than before. They seemed to be waging a war against anyone who dared to enter their territory. Sarah and her team spent months studying the creatures, trying to understand their behavior and develop a plan of attack. They knew that they had to act quickly before the creatures caused more damage. Finally, they were ready. They had developed a new toxin, one that was even more potent than the one they had used before. They knew that it was risky. The creatures were smarter now, and they had learned from their previous defeat. Sarah and her team ventured into the Outback, armed with the new toxin and their expertise. The creatures were waiting for them, and they attacked with a ferocity that Sarah had never seen before. The battle was intense. Sarah and her team fought bravely, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. The creatures seemed to be impervious to the toxin, and they were attacking with a coordinated strategy that suggested they had some sort of intelligence. Sarah knew that they were in trouble. They had to retreat, but they couldn't leave the creatures to roam free. She made a quick decision and ordered her team to detonate explosives that they had placed around the creature's territory. The explosion was massive, and the ground shook with the force of it. Sarah and her team barely had time to run for cover before the blast hit. When it was over, they emerged to find that the creatures had been eliminated once again. Sarah felt a sense of relief, but also a deep sadness. The creatures were not evil. She knew that now. They were simply trying to protect their home, and they had been pushed to attack because of human encroachment. She knew that the cycle would continue unless something was done to protect the creature's territory. She vowed to devote the rest of her life to finding a way for humans and the creatures to coexist peacefully, and she hoped that one day it would be possible. The aftermath of the battle left Sarah and her team exhausted and injured. They had lost some of their colleagues in the fight, and the damage caused by the explosion was immense. The Outback had been scarred, and it would take years for the land to recover. Sarah knew that she had to keep her promise to find a way for humans and the creatures to coexist peacefully. She spent the next few years studying the creatures' behavior, trying to understand how they communicated and how they interacted with their environment. As she delved deeper into her research, she discovered that the creatures were not the mindless beasts that many people believed them to be. They had a sophisticated social structure, and a language that was more complex than any other animal that she had studied. She also discovered that the creatures had a deep connection to the land. They were able to sense changes in the environment long before humans could, and they had a profound understanding of the ecosystem. Sarah realized that if humans were to coexist with the creatures, they would have to learn from them. They would have to respect the creatures' connection to the land and find ways to live in harmony with the environment. She began working with the government and local communities to develop sustainable practices that would protect the creature's territory. She also worked with local schools to educate children about the creatures and the importance of protecting the environment. It was a slow process, but over time the attitudes towards the creatures began to change. People began to see them as intelligent beings rather than mindless beasts, and they started to take steps to protect their territory. Sarah also continued her research, studying the creatures' language and developing ways to communicate with them. She discovered that they were able to understand basic human language, and she began to teach them how to communicate in return. As the years passed, Sarah's work became recognized on a global scale. She was invited to speak at conferences and was consulted by governments and organizations around the world on issues related to wildlife conservation. Despite the success of her work, Sarah never forgot the creatures that had first led her on this path. She continued to study them and to work towards finding new ways for humans and the creatures to coexist peacefully. In the end, Sarah realized that her work was not just about protecting the creatures of the outback. It was about finding a way for humans to live in harmony with the environment, to respect and honor the natural world that sustained them. As she looked back on her life's work, Sarah knew that she had made a difference. She had helped to change people's attitudes towards the creatures and had worked to protect the environment. And as she gazed out at the vast expanse of the outback, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for the creatures that had led her on this incredible journey. Sarah sat on the porch of her small cabin, watching the sunset over the outback. It had been many years since the creatures had returned and the war had ended, and Sarah was now an old woman. As she looked out at the landscape, she reflected on her life's work. She had dedicated her life to protecting the creatures and the environment, and she had seen a remarkable transformation in people's attitudes towards them. She remembered the fear and hostility that people had felt towards the creatures when she first encountered them, and how much had changed over the years. Now the creatures were protected by law, and their territory was considered sacred. Sarah's work had also inspired others to follow in her footsteps. Many young people had taken up the cause of protecting the environment, and there was a growing awareness of the importance of living in harmony with nature. As she sat there, Sarah felt a sense of peace knowing that her life's work had made a difference. She had accomplished what she had set out to do, and she knew that her legacy would live on through the work of others. She took a deep breath, inhaling the sweet scent of the outback, and closed her eyes. She felt content, knowing that she had done everything she could to protect the creatures and the environment that she loved so much. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Sarah smiled, knowing that her work would continue even after she was gone. She had given everything she had to protect the outback, and she knew that it would continue to thrive, thanks to the efforts of those who had been inspired by her life's work.